And it is that unpredictable action that can create costs on complex supply chains. If you'll recall this morning, that little notation that I had squeezed into the bottom of that really nice looking diagram, I conceptualise the supply chain as the flow of goods on the one hand going in one direction and the flow of funds going in the other direction, subject to information about the things satisfying conditions. What we're talking about here is when people do a number of things. One is create blockages in the flow of information about things, which creates problems for the release of funds flowing back the other way. That's one. But the other thing that that possibility engenders in supply chains is the possibility that rational actors, sensible business owners, usually chief financial officers and lawyers, and what they say to their boards, which is, we're not quite sure that someone's going to settle on time. What do? Well, the first thing we do is that we hold cash. We withdraw money from the circulation process and hoard it in the event that we need to draw on that to settle our own accounts. So the first thing that happens in an environment where capricious conduct and the possibility of non-payment exists is that actors hold cash. Now, the minute actors hold cash or money, and the money isn't circulating smoothly through a supply chain, that has knock-on effects. So as each actor does that, the risk within an ecosystem like a supply chain is that we lose sufficient liquidity. And without sufficient liquidity, the products themselves stop moving. So how does the supply chain deal with this? It usually deals with it through the instruments of credit. So supply chains, rather than hoard or use their own hoards of money, use money provided by a third party. And that third party could actually be a vendor finance, or it could be a subsequent third party exogenous to the two parties of the transaction who provides finance. And finance basically means the provision of a promise that someone else will come good on the payment in the event that someone else hasn't. Now that comes at a cost. Our own analysis of the beef supply chain estimates that the cost of what I'd basically call non-productive capital, namely cash flow finance, exacts on the whole chain of somewhere between 10 to 12%. Now imagine if you could remove that cost out of the supply chain in one fell swoop by improving the information flows and also by radically eradicating the conditions precedent for capricious action. And we can do that by reducing the likelihood of information asymmetry. Now, I just want to bring 2 points to bear here. I'll go back because that's the interesting stuff, and that's Charles. The 2 kinds of actions that we're interested in, ultimately, are what we generally call the 2 hiddens. One is hidden information, and the other one is hidden behaviour, which of course often results in hidden information, because I'll do something secretly and not tell you about it, so because you don't know about it, there's a sense that there's hidden information. But there are kinds of hidden informations, or one of these hiddens, if you will, that I've been talking about. They are things like, I'm hiding information from you about the state of the product. I'm hiding it, so from a supply perspective, the seller's point of view. I'm hiding information about the condition of the product, the availability of the product, my own financial position, all those sorts of things. They could all be things that I'm not providing information about. Similarly, from the buy side, the hiddens are whether I'm good for the money, whether I actually intend on fulfilling and satisfying all the terms of the contract, or whether in fact I'm planning to game this down the track, such as when the goods arrive at the docks, and there's something Charles will get into, I come up with some reasons to why maybe I won't pay everything right now, even though we agreed to do so. And it goes to the discussion earlier about the role of instruments like banking instruments, letters of credit. There's lots of examples where letters of credit themselves are actually not good because the receiving bank and the issuing bank don't agree on the veracity of the terms and conditions of the letter of credit itself. So there's lots of places in which capricious conduct can happen on the basis of hidden information. Hidden behaviour, give you a conceptual example again just to illustrate the point, goes to situations where I've actually loaded a bunch of animals or a bunch of product onto a ship, and I don't actually tell you that I've loaded the dodgy stuff or the stuff that's about to go off, and just put it on, and by the time it gets to you, well, it's no longer my problem, provided that you don't discover what I've just done. So these are two very, very classic examples within our supply chain and in most supply chains in general where we run into capricious conduct risk. And as I intimated this morning, one of the benefits of data-driven smart contracts is the ability to largely eradicate those sorts of problems. The downside, of course, in doing that is that we create a world which is very, very definite. And of course, in the real world, we also know that circumstances change and maybe things are never quite so black and white. And perhaps on that note, I'll flick this hospital pass over to Charles, who will enlighten you about some of the real life experiences and real life costs that are being incurred each and every day in the red meat supply chain as we try and navigate these sorts of problems.
Thank you. What I'd like to do is look at things from the buyer's perspective. I guess a lot of what we do focuses on the technology coming from a producer or a seller, but sometimes the buyer's obviously on the other side of the fence. So for the next few paragraphs, we'll just think about them. When something adversely affects the price, how do they feel? Do they feel they're entitled to a discount? Maybe the spot price has dropped in the market. They're almost feeling that they've lost. So what can they do about that? Perhaps there's an instrument that means they could have hedged the price. Not everybody understands that, or there's not necessarily tools currently available that will make them feel comfortable in engaging in that sort of transaction. So number one, non-payment. You know, the first thing that comes up, I never trusted him anyway. So how can I get out of this deal? What, you know, just look at him. Do I trust this fella? So, you know, what can I do? Deferred payment. Can I string this out? Can I try and make my money last a bit longer? Perhaps, you know, I'm waiting for the market to move to make me feel a bit more comfortable. Or partial payment. Shall I just pay him a bit? You know, that'll make me feel better, getting one over on him to an extent. Or do we try the age-old renegotiate the price? Your meat's no good. I want a deal. You know, these are real-world things that happen all of the time. It's unfortunate, but it's actually true. Then we look at the bottom one, the insurance claim. Nobody likes insurers. Everybody feels they get a win if you can claim on your policy. Maybe I'll make a claim. I'll say the goods never arrived in the correct condition. The other things we could look at, these weren't the animals I bought. I asked for a certain thing, a certain breed, a certain size. That's certainly not what I feel I've been given. I'll try and get out of it that way. We'll look at number two. The meat was off. Well, really, you know, there is temperature control measures in place. There's devices that can track all of that. But who is responsible? Who do we make a claim to? Do we claim against the supplier, the transporter, or just go straight back to the insurance? He's the easy target, really. But there is technology that can perhaps help us with a lot of these issues. There's a terrible story about animals dying in transit. However, later the carcasses were found butchered and buried locally. So perhaps it was just a bit of a scam. Somebody wanted to make a claim against the insurer. So we just go back to that one. Claims for live cattle deaths in transit. This is just from one local insurer where we've got a source in there that's given us some information. They're paying out round about $1 million a year, no questions asked, just because it's too hard to prove it otherwise. Technology can certainly play a role in addressing a lot of those issues for the insurer. We got access to smart ear tags that will at least show the levels of stress during travelling, the location, you know, very simple things which would actually help to solve some of these issues. Number two, claims around temperature controlled haulage error. doesn't sound too complicated to put the thermostat at the right setting while the goods are in transit. However, for this one particular insurer, this is a $2 million a year payout. Surely it can't be complicated to get somebody or a device to monitor that. Number 3 is a great one. This is one, I know we've got some friends from the US here, so this is particularly one that happens in the US on a Friday afternoon. Boxes get damaged, get taken away. Obviously Friday afternoon is barbecue day on the docks in America. All of these really point that there's a lack of ability to apportion responsibility of the assets during transport. It is an easy fix. But do we really need to trust each other before entering a trade? Or should we trust a system that can operate without prejudice using only IoT devices that will provide the facts to a series of questions regarding states that will lead to a transaction being completed with unquestionable outcomes?
Back to me. They are just classic war stories, and that only touches the tip of the iceberg. We're dealing with a situation where there's a claim a week on average for meat that has gone off, where nobody holds responsibility, no one can prove responsibility for when that happened. Now that can happen anywhere from when the product has sat on the loading dock at the boning room, all the way through to sitting at customs and everything in between. What I wanted to do was talk to you about, I guess, the next version of that particular situation, and that is not only the question of whether or not the product has gone off in transit, but perhaps trying to understand what the economics are of being able to do something about it by thinking through what the different permutations are between a product arriving in perfect condition and a product arriving with a shelf life equal to 0. Because a product that has gone off is a product with a shelf life equal to 0. The science tells us that meat protein degrades as a function of exposure to temperatures typically above 2 degrees and oxygen and for air for the meat to progressively go off. We know that the relationship is non-linear and cumulative, which means that the longer it is exposed in a cumulative way to the wrong conditions, the greater or the speedier the degradation of the product is. Now what that gives us is essentially a mathematical function that creates an economic relationship between the amount of days still available for that product to be sold after it's arrived, that is arrival date to use by date, and the cost of maintaining an ecosystem that optimises that use by date outcome for the buyer. What we're suggesting here, and this is some preliminary work that we're doing, is that there is a tangible economic value based on a certain kind of transparency that says an investment in X, Y, and Z devices, number one, to measure temperature conditions during the transit period is warranted because we're able to not only provide much greater clarity around responsibility during transit, which helps the insurance business case, but we can also deliver a measure of product condition in relationship to the extent of time it's still got left before the use by date has arrived. If use by date 0 means it's worth 0, then somewhere between that and perfect condition is, I guess, what we're dealing with as a range of economic opportunities for the distributor, the wholesaler, or the retailer. And what we can now start to explore, and this is very, very early work for us, but what we can start to explore is the discounting that exists the closer a piece of meat gets, on average, to its use by date. Because we know, and I think everyone knows from common sense, that the closer something gets to that day where its shelf life is 0, the more likely the retailer discounts heavily to move it and to get it off the shelves and sold. So we know that at some point or another, the price of that product drops significantly the closer it gets to that use by date. Therefore, the reverse applies. The further we are able to keep that product away from its use by date, from the moment it's gone through transit, the closer it should be to the optimal price that can be achieved for that given product. So, for example, if the price point is 100, and 100 represents product arriving in the condition it's meant to, the fact that it arrives in a condition that is suboptimal to that, condition minus whatever, shouldn't mean that the product's rejected per se, but it does mean that perhaps we actually recalibrate the pricing based on a sliding scale. Why should we do that? Well, one, it actually reflects the distribution of risk, if you will, away from those who are responsible for transport to those who are now stuck with the product with a shorter amount of time to sell it. But it also creates the economic incentives for those who are involved in the transportation of the product and for ensuring the quality of the product during transportation, that the incentive is there for them to invest in the technologies that you need, one, to monitor, but two, to make improvements in the actual conditions. Anecdotal evidence tells us that reefers, refrigerated containers, often go through experiences such as having the cooling systems unplugged during periods of the transit to save a bit of money. Right? It happens on boats, it happens on the back of trucks and all those sorts of things. No one will notice, I'll unplug it for half a day or a day. That happens. Right? We know that the seals around the doors of the reefers aren't always maintained to optimal conditions. We all know when we've got dodgy seals around fridges at home that in fact the products themselves are not being stored in optimal conditions. But why would anybody who owns a reefer bother fixing it if they've got no reason to? But once we can start to calibrate information around which reefers are performing optimally and which ones aren't, then it becomes very clear in a market sense that certain operators and certain reefers should be preferred to others. But it also says that if you're happy with the cheaper product, if you're happy with the dodgy seals around the fridge, because your beef's actually pretty cheap at the end of the day, and the guy at the other end is actually a commodity trader who's looking for cheap, well, go cheap. Right? This starts to rationalise the distribution of risk based on clarity of information. Now, this starts to introduce the idea that inside smart contracts, we can introduce variability to take into account changes of conditions. And I was just having a chat with this lady before about exactly this issue, and that is the need, as we start to design smart contracts, that we understand that sometimes the world is very black or very white, but usually the world is incredibly grey. And in designing the way in which we execute smart contracts, we need to actually take half a step back and think a lot more about the shades of greyness that we're working with, and then reflect upon how those shades of grey become datarised, if you will. Because once we can datarise those things, we can give people at least some levels of certainty against capriciousness, despite the fact that there is variation in greyness. I might flick back to Charles as we sort of shift quickly from, again, conceptual to maybe, oh, actually I did one thing. This is something pretty cool. We actually executed a smart contract back in December 2017. I can't remember the address at the moment in Ethereum, but I'll find it one day and I'll let you know. But it was for the buying and selling of live cattle. And I think this was probably the first time it was ever done. In the very early days, just as CryptoKitties hit the Ethereum network. And we designed this to, in a sense, write a smart contract that could take into account a buyer and a seller, defining cattle, some of their conditions, prices, and also how payments got executed. So in our case, when the status of cows changed, which was change of ownership, the buyer was able to change the status, and if the buyer didn't change the status within a given amount of time, the money that was in escrow would actually automatically be paid anyway. So it was just a way by which we were able to experiment and show the logics and the flows of what, at one level, are really complicated things, the buying and selling of cattle and the games that happen at the sale yards, with actually just a flow of logic. And the lesson learned out of that was it's probably best not to execute these sorts of things on a regular basis on the mainnet, particularly when you run into interference like CryptoKitties. And when sidechain technologies like Peter talked about earlier become more mature, we'll be more comfortable with operationalising these sorts of things in those environments. I think we did this back in December 2017. I think it was December 6 or 7. The guys in Singapore worked on overnighter and smashed it out. That's because I was speaking at a conference and I insisted. I stomped my feet and I said, I've got to show people, so make it work. So they made it work. And that was pretty cool. Over to you. Yeah, I've done that. That's what I talked about.
This is what happens when you refuse to work from notes. The slides get out of order.
Drain us, right?
So some financial risk can be shared through financial instruments, derivatives, futures, contracts, hedging. For example, exposure to foreign exchange risk can be mitigated by swapping currency requirements with another participant. I guess we all sort of understand that. Without becoming a financial bore, you probably all know enough about those type of things. Regarding, look, I love options, put options, call options. I believe they're a solution, or should we really say an insurance to many problems. Then we've got traditional insurance. No one likes paying a premium, but as we've discussed, insurance companies pay out when they have to. Could an insurance product be created that covers many of the risks that we've discussed here? Given all of the information we know we can now capture, the premium really should be quite small. So let's move away from the finance lecture and to a conversation perhaps of a bit more interest. We've got a few minutes left, so let's discuss the future. How does the future look, knowing some of the stuff we've discovered, knowing what we know? Should it still be the same? Should it be business as usual? Probably not. Both parties in a transaction taking unknown risks associated with their everyday business. That's probably not the smart way to keep going. We've also heard a lot about blockchain today. So here's a thought challenge for you. Not a physical challenge, just a thought challenge. We're in the beef supply, as you know. If we take that as an example, but the learnings will be applicable to many other supply chains. Some of the things we want to do. We want to have a system that doesn't rely solely on trust. If we're dealing with a new trading partner, possibly overseas, it's hard to build rapport with that person, and it's the rapport that we usually rely on for trust. If we have a system that controls risk, limited or known risk from both parties, it will lead to smoother transactions and more satisfactory outcomes for both parties. So, can we create a financial instrument that allows people to value risk against opportunity, that provides for safety and dependability, that can allow us to assess market depth and liquidity? These sort of instruments are well known and they do already exist. But if we can have those constructed, deployed on a blockchain, with an exchange enabling the exchange of risk in micro-load transactions, providing opportunities to deal better with agri-risk, which has to date been out of reach of most institutional or ordinary trade investors, that's our challenge.
Thank you very much.
And that's it.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
That was a really fantastic example that you had. A wonderful use case. That's really good.
Very good.
Our next speaker is Kamran. Najeebullah. He has a background in cyber-physical systems, game theory, mechanism design, and complexity. He's with Data 61, and he's going to talk to us today about blockchain-based solutions for traceability and trust management in supply chains. Welcome, Kamran.
Good afternoon, everyone. I assume you're all tired, but I promise to make it as interesting as possible. I need to attest first that I'm presenting on behalf of my colleagues, Sidra, Walken, Salil, and Raja. I'm part of the group, but I'm working on other interests, which are quite similar, but are not part of this presentation. And the authors have generously provided these slides as well, so credit to them again. My talk today will be dealing with two different problems. They are quite connected, although. The first part is about a framework called product chain, and product chain is actually a solution based on blockchain for supply chains that provides provenance or supports provenance. And the second part is about trust chain, which is an add-on onto this framework that ensure trust using a penalty and incentive-based mechanism. So I'll start with the broad motivation, although we have heard quite a lot about the motivation of use of blockchain in supply chain networks. But this is, although the work that I'm presenting about applies to, in general, all the supply chains, but we are actually following the example of a food supply chain, probably because it is easier to motivate. There's a lot of motivation in providing farm to fork stories in terms of marketing for the companies, but there's been recent food contamination scandals that have actually promoted this demand on the consumer side as well. So talking about the salmonella outbreak in multiple states in the US that took 2 months to face, and that was actually in the papayas imported from Mexico. And I think most of us know about the needles scandal in the strawberries here in Australia that cost millions of dollars and a lot of hysteria. A recent study in the US actually showed that they found heavy metals in the baby food. So there's a higher demand on the consumer side for more traceability, transparency, and provenance in food supply chains. Now, the existing systems, I would say like systems prior to blockchain, are not suitable for this kind of solution. First, because they are disparate, there's no coordination between them. They are centralized, so they have security issues. The data is unreliable because you're basically trusting the entity who is inputting the data. There's no way to verify if the data is correct or not. And there's very limited consumer access. So they're not, you would say, the real farm to fork stories that you're looking for. But the good thing is, we have blockchain. Now all the salient features that we have heard about repeatedly today, integrity, availability, traceability, provenance, they all help in promoting provenance, and they can help towards building trust as well. But, again, a big but, is blockchain readily available or readily applicable to supply chains? If it is, what should be the role of the blockchain in this situation? And these questions are important because I haven't heard them today, anyone asking these kind of questions. So let's discuss this a bit. So what should be the role of the blockchain? Yes, it's immutable data, but what if people are uploading garbage data? So you have immutable garbage data. What about the scalability issues? The chain gets longer, the harder it is, the so-called consensus get harder and harder. What do we do about that? And can we actually integrate IoT sensors into our systems? Because they've been in higher demands now because of their ability to provide more transparency, more traceability, and they've been adopted by a lot of supply chain companies. So can we actually include them into our systems as well? But most crucially, as we have seen in the first Leaf Ledger presentation as well, privacy. Now, blockchain is a public ledger, and it was supposed to be that because you need to know how much money do you have, because you shouldn't be able to spend more than that. But in this case, the entities that are involved in the supply chain are actually self-entrusted, and they might have secrets that they might not be really looking to share with their competitors, which might also be on the supply chain. So how do we deal with that? So are we able to provide them privacy by keeping the supply chain on blockchain? Is this possible? And again, data access as well. What kind of information should be available to whom? Who is able to access what, and who is able to write what? So these are the kind of questions that we are trying to answer in our first solution, which is called product chain. Now, what it tries to do is that it tries to bring in a custodian of the participants and non-participants and the governing bodies on to a permissioned blockchain. I'll talk about these a bit in detail, so this is just an overview. We try to address the scalability problem by using multiple side chains, and there are other efforts as well that I'll discuss later. Yes, we can integrate IoTs by creating transactions that are directly input by the IoT devices into the blockchain. So this is the solution that is proposed here. Privacy and data access, we use some off-shelf access through customized BC explorers, but in order to do that, we have actually utilized the permission blockchain again, and we will be defining permissions on our ACL, which is the access control list, and I'll talk about that in detail as well. So this work has been published, and you can actually read it in detail if you are interested. So this is the overall architecture of product chain, and as you can see here that we have some governing bodies like food control and audit, we have government associations, and we have BC technology vendors who would come together, sit with the participating members, and define a set of rules. Now these rules are about who can write what, who can read what, and what should be the standards for assigning a quality to a product. Now here the BC vendor is actually not a permanent member, so he doesn't get the say into who gets what, but he gets say into is it possible to implement that or not. And he is here for this kind of opinion. Now these rules are put into an ACL, which is access control list, which is managed by the BC technology vendor again. And then through this ACL, various participating member and non-participating member can access the blockchain for the information that they are reading or writing from it. Now, this is a three-tiered architecture. So it's bottom up here. So in the first tier, we have some food supply chain participants that are divided into geographical zones. And for every geographical zone, we have a sidechain. And every sidechain has a set of servers that we call validators. So the transactions that are produced by the participants in those particular zones are then validated by the validators assigned to their particular sidechain. And then the information that is collected and stored into this local blockchain is then verified and then uploaded into a global blockchain. I'll talk about these steps in more detail as well. So let's go and look into the first tier. So the first tier is simple apart from the type of transactions that can take place at this level. So if you look closely, there are actually only three kinds of transactions taking place: the create, the transfer, and the produce. A create transaction is created by the primary producer, and in food supply chains it's mostly the farmer. They use a create transaction to add a new product to the supply chain. Then whenever the ownership of the product is switched from one entity to another, we have a transfer transaction. And then when it reaches manufacturer, the manufacturer actually has access to a produce transaction, which combines various raw materials together to make a transaction of produce. And then we have a product that is then transported by the logistics. And again, at every step we have a transaction which is a transfer. So it's basically the transfer of ownership. Now, I'm actually looking at the second tier now. And in second tier, we have various servers who act as validators, and these servers are deployed by the BTV, the blockchain technology vendor. And it actually shows you another point where we are actually trying to improve on the scalability. In our model, we assume that all the participants are authorized users. They are certified by an authority. So there is some level of trust already in the supply chain entities. Now, whenever a transaction is generated, it is assigned to one of the validators from that particular geographical zone. It validates it, and then it broadcasts it after validation. And then afterwards, another validator is randomly selected from the rest of the validators on the basis of a lottery. And then that validator needs to verify the finding of the first validator. If it does verify the finding of the first validator, it is broadcasted to all the validators, and then they put it into their local blockchains, which are then in turn synced into the global one. In case, if it is not verified by the second or the first validator, then it will be assigned to one by one all of the validators, and in the end, we will take the consensus on the basis of voting. So what we are doing is that we are eliminating the proof of work from here, which is one of the most costly or resource consuming tasks, and replace it with lottery and voting. And this is how we actually improve on scalability as well. Now the third tier is simple because it just provides interface into all the tasks that you can perform on the blockchain. And it will provide provenance information to consumers if you request so that if the consumer just reads a QR code, it will provide provenance information, what the origin of the product is, where the raw materials came from, who were involved in the supply, what kind of information that the entities want available for the consumer can be shown. It can also include certifications from the food authorities and the government agencies that are assigned to that product or to that seller. And a regulatory authority, if it has actually rejected or accepted or revoked the access of a supplier or a producer, this information can also be shown. Now this is an example of how it works. So you have a chocolate bar at a store called C-Mart, and you can scan the barcode or the QR code on the chocolate bar, and it can take you to the dairy farmer Bob and to the cocoa farmer George simply through 5 or 6 steps. And I'll show that actually going through this chain is relatively simple and it takes very little time. Yep. So the first one here shows you the validation time. The first graph on the left shows you the time it takes for validation, and here baseline actually represents it's a base model in Caliper, and Caliper is a tool used for verification of blockchain technologies implemented through Hyperledger. So it's one of the base models that is being compared here, and the validation, how much time it takes in our implementation and how much it takes in the base one, that they are being compared here. The second one shows you, so here it says the product ledger size. So the product ledger size is actually the length or the number of transactions that are required to reach the source. So in case of cocoa farmer, it's the product ledger size is 5. So you need 5 transactions to reach from the product to one of the provider, to one of the suppliers. Now we also tested with changing the number of the side chains, and you can see that the first bar shows if the one side chain is used, the orange one shows that 2 are used, and the gray one shows that 3 are used. And it shows that if the product ledger size is 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, and 35, what is the amount of time that they take in actually responding to that query of provenance. Now there's a bigger difference between first and second when you go to the larger side of the number of queries, the size of product ledger, and that is because the first time when it has to switch between one and multiple shards or side chains, it has to locate all of them, and then it has to run after that. But afterwards, the difference is not that big because that return part has already been done, and afterwards it's a simple process of locating all of them and going through them. Now, this brings to the end of the first part of the talk, which is about the product chain. And interestingly, we have issued two important questions. First, this will be able to provide traceability. This will be able to provide integrity, but only for the data that is on the blockchain. Now, we heard about this before earlier today as well. What happened to the data before it is being uploaded to the blockchain? Blockchain has no control over it, and it cannot ensure the level of trust, or it cannot build a level of trust on the basis of the data that is not verified by it, or it cannot be verified by it. So what we do is that we define a mechanism that cannot entirely control that the data is truthful, but what it will do is that it will create this environment where people who are honest are actually incentivized, and a penalty is put on the people who are dishonest. And for this, for the trust and reputation systems, we use existing systems from the e-commerce. But the problem with the existing trust and reputation management systems is that they have very little observation. For example, most of the reviews are done by the people who are assumed to have bought the product, when in some cases they haven't even bought it as well. It has very low level of granularity. Like, for example, the reviews are mostly about a seller, or they are about a particular product, but not more than that. The last thing is that there is a lack of automation, so agents need to be involved to assign those ratings. So if you bought a product and if you haven't had the time to go and rate it, there will be no rating. So how do we address these questions? Well, we add all those features. So what we do is that we add more granularity by creating pairs of commodities and the entities and assigning a rating for all of those pairs. So not just a seller is reviewed, but a seller is reviewed for every product that they are supplying. We obtain information from different sources, like here you can see in the bottom. Not only that we receive information from the trade parties, we also receive information from IoT sensors and from the regulatory authorities. So you can actually verify the information received from one source with information from the other. We have an accountability mechanism that I'm going to show, which will be enforced through a smart contract, which also makes it automated. And we do all this, all of these features are involved using very little overhead time. So let's start with the three-layered architecture again, and the first layer is data layer. So we assume that at every stage in the supply chain, from the primary producer to the retailer, we have IoT sensors installed at every step. We also assume that there is a regulator who is occasionally or periodically checking or assessing the quality of the product at every step. We also have that traders can actually rate each other at the time of every transaction. So whenever the ownership is transferred from one person to another, the buyer can actually rate the seller. So these are the kind of observations that we are retrieving, and they can be used to validate all the kind of information that we are receiving. Moving on to the next layer, which is the largest in this case. So I will be discussing what ACL is, the access control list, what the smart contracts look like, what is the reputation trust module, and what are the profiles. I don't think I have to talk about the ledger because that's what we have talked about all day. So the access control list is a very simple document which defines rules for who can access what and who can do what in the system. And they're very logical rules. You can see that a participant of the supply chain should not be able to make changes to their own profile. Well, this will defeat the purpose because the ratings are there. If they can actually change them, then why are we putting the ratings all together? For the regulatory purposes, for the audit purposes, we know that the regulator should be able to see the entire history of all the entities. but the entity itself should not be able to look into the history of other entities because that will reveal trade secrets. And for supply chain participants, how do we incur penalties? We can actually revoke the access of an entity if they have not been able to maintain a certain amount of trust, let's say for a certain amount of period, and after that they can be resumed. They can be removed altogether, but that depends on the rules that are defined. Now that is how it looks like. So we have two kind of smart contracts here. One is the quality contract and the other one is called the rating contract. Now in the quality contract, we can actually acquire data from all the sensors. We can write ratings for the commodities, for the products, and we can generate warning as well. So what it contains is, it contains boundary values for, let's say, sensor data. So for example, if there is a temperature sensor, say there is a product which would be safe between 10 degrees and 20 degrees, and it will generate a warning if the temperature is below or above this level. Then it also has threshold for damage. For example, if the temperature is between 20 and 30 degrees, what would be the decay in the quality of the product? And then according to those brackets, it is able to assign a rating to the commodity. We have a rating contract which is for sellers particularly. What it does is that it collects sensor information, it collects buyer ratings, and it collects the trader ratings, which is the regulator ratings, and it combines them together to assign a rating for the seller. I'll show you in detail. So first, what the quality contract does is that at every time step, it collects the sensor information and it combines all those values together to create a reputation on the basis of sensory information. What the rating contract does is that it takes this reputation of the sensory information, combines it with the ratings from the traders and the ratings from the regulators, and create a score for the seller. Now this is just a reputation rating, like for example, you're 5-star, you have done really well. But you cannot base your decision on this actually. It needs to be more than that. Oh, before I forget. So also, we promote this behavior where it is only the latest transactions of a seller that really matters. So we want the market to be sustainable. So if you have done something wrong and it was a long time ago, we don't want it to affect your profile right now. So there is a forgetting factor, the beta Tn minus T, which actually forgets about the historical ratings that you have got. Now this is the trust rating, because trust rating might not only be dependent on the ratings, the reputation rating that we have generated before. It might also be dependent on the external factors, and the external factors can be number of transactions or number of transactions that have successfully been completed, or it can be consumer feedback. And on the basis of those, you actually define those F1, F2, and Fn, and you assign a weight to all of them. And this weighted sum actually gives you a trust value for each trader. Now the last part. Again, the application layer is pretty simple. All it does is that it provides interface to all the operations that can be performed on the system. So using the access control list, it lets the users read or write to the blockchain, or it also has this function of publishing the leaderboard, where if you have done really well and your ratings are really nice, it puts you on a portal saying these are the leaders, these have been the most outperforming entities in our blockchain, so that you can get more business. And it can also actually, it also provides interface to the regulators to put penalties on the entities that are not performing as well or not able to maintain the trust. So they can actually revoke them, and if their revocation period has been expired, then they can actually reinstate them, and that is the kind of stuff that you can do through the application layer. Now, the security analysis here shows what kind of trust breaches that we can actually handle. And interesting thing is that for sensory data, like the data collected from the IoT sensors, we relied on the existing literature actually, which says that they make the sensors tamper-proof, and the data cannot be manipulated, not by tampering with the sensors and not while during the communication between the sensor or the hub. So this is from the prior work. If you move a bit further, you see ballot stuffing, and this is like when you collude together, like some entities collude together to create a fake product and say that and give each other good rating on the basis of that. But we prevent that by limiting ratings only for the products that are sold in the end. If the product is not sold, you cannot be rated for it. Bad mouthing attack, or in other terms what you would call malicious rating or unfair rating, is the most crucial one. And we actually have a proof that you cannot actually prevent that without a mediator. You definitely need a mediator to tackle this, but the level on which the mediator can tackle this is variable depending on the rules. So put it in the moderate resistance. Lastly, we compare it again to a baseline, to the base model in Caliper. And in the first instance, you can see the latency in seconds against the transaction send rate. It is the number of transactions in a second. And you can see that the difference is pretty minimal. In fact, the highest amount of time that it takes to return a query is around 37 seconds, which is pretty small. And that is also assuming that there's a high load there as well. And that's pretty much it. Thank you.
So you're itching to get on.
Yes,
Katrina.
I am.
Katrina probably doesn't need much introduction. She's been in this space for a long time.
I have.
Yeah, no, it's fucking that.
Oh.
Katrina started the Women in Blockchain group here in Australia. She has her as a civic ledger, a personal friend of many years, and she's going to talk to us about water trading and blockchain technology today. Take it away.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you everyone for staying. This has been a long day. I am basically, what I'm going to be doing today is basically pulling everything that you've heard for the last 6 hours into a real life use case that we're actually working on here in Australia. So for those who don't know me, I think everyone basically might know who I am. My name is Katrina Donaghy. I'm the CEO and co-founder of a company here in Brisbane called Civic Ledger. We work on really interesting problems with government, namely water, intellectual property and some built environment applications. So I have been around for a little while. On this stage on the 3rd of November, there's a few of you in this room that actually remember 2016. We had the inaugural blockchain symposium here. Chris, you were here. You were over there. There was a few of us here. So we had 150 people in this room talking about this technology, which was really interesting because it was very unheard of. And we stacked this room, and for about 3 hours, we had some amazing conversations. So it really always makes me interested that we're having, again, we're getting really down into some really interesting areas. So instead of talking broadly about blockchain like we did 3 years ago, we're really starting to get like verticals like supply chains. I come from government background, did my stuff at Griffith University, for any Griffith University people here, but I'm also involved with the Australian Digital Commerce Association. So next week we've got our 3rd APAC Blockchain Conference, and as well as our inaugural Blockchain Awards, which I'll be at. And we were a Finny Awards winner last year, and as mentioned, I do the Women in Blockchain right here on this stage once a month, and we've now got Women in Blockchain in Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, Perth, so it's quite a movement now, which is great because a lot of women work in this area. So civic ledger builds protocols and platforms. When we first started, we actually looked at applications such as entitlements and how they move digitally across blockchain. We've come a long way because we have been co-creating with government rather than sitting in our rooms and tinkering around with the tech. So we look at two things, which is protocols and platforms, mainly marketplaces. So how do regulated marketplaces work in the future for government? So way back in 2017, we worked with the Australian government. We secured a contract with the Australian government to look at how do we solve the problem of transparency in our Australian water markets. Now we delivered that project 2 years ago, and it's just interesting on the conversations that are happening in this country with regard to water trading. I think you can pick up the newspaper nearly every day and something will be talking about corruption, finger pointing, lack of transparency, water price being too high, things like that. So we've been sitting back for the last 2 years waiting for the opportunity to bring what we've been working on out into the public, and I'm going to talk to you about what we've done. So basically there was a national feasibility study to improve the transparency of water markets. I think this is quite poignant. I think we always start with this quote. Mark Twain was quite a brilliant man to sort of work out about 150 years ago that we would be having these sort of conversations around water. And we see in the future that there's going to be probably a substantial amount of conflict because we won't be able to get access to water that is high quality. So we're trying to solve that problem in Australia. So why is it complicated? I think you've been hearing some real common themes from all the presenters. The big challenge for anything is information asymmetry. When we don't have transparency in the transaction, we don't know who's in the transaction, or we don't know where the data has come from, we don't trust it. And so we have to put intermediaries into that transaction, and in Australia they're called water brokers. What they do is that they facilitate the trade. So what happens is, because it's very complicated to trade the water, you get quite a few irrigators don't participate. And as a result, you don't have to in the around trying to allow our Australian government to manage the tension between industry water, agricultural water, environmental water and urban water. So agriculture is the biggest use of water in this country, yet we don't actually have anything joined up. Our registries are all different. So in Australia, the Australian government is responsible for the regulatory of the market, but it's the states governments that are responsible for allocating those waters to irrigators. So Queensland's different to New South Wales, which is different to Victoria, which is different to South Australia. But there are 300 its own little jurisdiction. And in those jurisdictions is a phenomenal amount of business rules on how that water can be traded. So we do work out that there was, when we actually looked at the markets, there's 300 water products, 15,000 business rules. So if you're an irrigator and you want to trade, you've got to know all this stuff. And a lot of it is paper, and it's built up over time, and it's very, very difficult to get your head around. So this is why water brokers are in the role in doing a $3 billion industry. We are really good at water trading, but we're not good at interoperability or understanding where our data is or who is trading with who. So what we see with the problem, as we've talked about, we see that trades are withheld, we don't see full irrigators in the market, and so we're not actually seeing full optimisation of our water assets. So it's really interesting to know, even in drought, which we have a lot of in this country, we actually have quite a lot of water. But it's very difficult to find, and it's very difficult to get it into markets. And we basically did some testing too to sort of work out, well, is this truly a problem for the irrigators? And it is. What we find is it's the corporate irrigators that actually do get to play in the market, but the ones that don't, we call sleepers and dozers, they tend to not actually participate. But I think what we've all worked out by listening to a lot of the speakers here today is that when we're talking about marketplaces, you do need it to be quite rational. And to do that, you need to have data that you can trust, or the integrity of the data. You need players in that acting rationally. So one of the things, I don't know if many people have talked about blockchain as a governance technology. I think we started talking about it with Data 61, but that's how we come into this market in terms of the problems we solve. We are big fans of RMIT with Professor Jason Potts' work, and I know we've got some colleagues in the audience today. But we do see that blockchain technology creates governance. It allows the business rules to be agreed on how something can be actually transacted. And this is why water is so interesting, because we actually can codify the rules into a litre of water to allow those transactions or those trades to occur. This is again just basic understanding of what's happening in Australia. As I mentioned, there's 4 legacy systems. So we have, the state government holds registries of those trades, but they are different. So Victoria is probably the most advanced, it's about 15 years old. South Australia's got $14.7 million at the moment, where they're investigating on how to actually look at their water registries. So it's a really interesting problem to solve. So what we built was a registration and a marketplace. So we use the Ethereum blockchain, we use a public blockchain. And the reason why we use a public blockchain is because this information, by law, needs to be discovered. You can actually go and query these registries. They are behind a few walls, but technically you should be able to, as a taxpayer, be able to work out who was trading with who. And because we take a protocol approach to the way we build our solutions, we want to have open data that has highest levels of integrity, so people can actually innovate on. And I think that's that to us is the value proposition of blockchain technology. It's not about going and creating all these private permissions systems and say the data cannot be found. Why are we doing that? So we're really interested on, if this information is to be required for public law, then we believe that this information should be valuable and should be found. So the challenge for most irrigators is that they actually don't know the price of water, and that's why they have the brokers. So if you don't know the price of water and you don't know the volume in your market, it's very difficult to trust that market. So those are the problems we solve. We bring transparency in price, so you're able to see the last trade and what the price was. You're able to query how much volume is in your market in terms of liquidity, but you're also able to verify who's in that market. We've talked, I think the previous discussion talked about the authority. In our transactions, it is the government that is the authority. They're the ones who actually set the rules and the legislation and the regulation to verify who has what. So we interoperate with those registries of where those licenses are held. So as I said, we solve a couple of challenges. The information is free, it's complete. It's frictionless trading, so because it is peer-to-peer and the intermediaries are out of the way, and we use the technology, smart contracts, blockchain to actually settle. At the moment we are minting our own AUD because we haven't gone digital Australian dollar yet. It is an real-time settlement and it increases water availability. Some of the lessons that we've learnt through working with this technology with government is it does come down to what problem you're solving and the design elements. One of the things that we find is still emerging, I guess, in the conversation with blockchain technology is the user experience. At the moment, it's pretty bad. I think we can agree in this room that the technology, because it is emerging, we have to be very mindful of what we're putting into our irrigators' hands, so it has to be as simple as possible. So we did try with MetaMask in the early days when we were putting our MVP together, but it's just too clunky. And it's very difficult to actually educate people when you've got these other things that they have to get their heads around. So you have to be very mindful of who you're solving the problem for. Pilots. We've been working 2 years for this. This is this is the challenge of working in blockchain technology when you're very early to market, is that you really need to wait for your industry to get on the journey with you. So we are now at the place where after 2 years we have finally got the Queensland Government, the water market and trading area, very interested in the work we're doing. They realise that they have a problem with regard to allocations and liquidity, and their current systems don't stack up. So they're very interested in blockchain technology. We have some amazing CRCs in this country. They're cooperative research centres. We have food agility. We had one with spatial information. But we've been working with the CRC for Northern Australia. I don't know if anyone's aware of the work that's going up there, but we actually have a minister for Northern Australia. So up in the north, Queensland, Northern Territory and Western Australia, there's a whole investment opportunity around agricultural products to be exported to the ASEAN area. The challenge is that there is water there, but there are no water markets. So instead of going and repeating what the Murray-Darling Basin has in terms of 15,000 business rules and all that sort of stuff, we're working with the CRC from Northern Australia to do a pilot in the Najeebullah irrigation area to understand how blockchain technology can be the next governance mechanism to establish markets in the northern part of Australia. If we actually agree through these pilots, because it is a research project, that blockchain technology is advantageous over current legacy systems, then it sets the scene for us to have a mature conversation in this country around how we do improve our water trading markets for the future. Every state is different, so Najeebullah is not in the Murray-Darling Basin, which is great, so we're not having to deal with the politics down there. But it gives us an opportunity to sort of put a wall around an irrigation area that does do frequent trading. They are mature, rational irrigators, and we've got the backing of them. So we're going to be putting this technology in the hands of cane growers. So we also think, you know, often some people will think that the agricultural sector is still coming up to speed with tech. No, they're actually way ahead on a lot of things in terms of the agricultural sector. They're very savvy and they are very open to exploring new technology because they understand that they have to. So Najeebullah is our first pilot. We've got a project in the pipeline with South Australian Government. We should learn next month if that's been funded. Now, South Australia has massive problems with their water allocations because they're actually at the bottom of Australia. So even though you have a water entitlement, you may not get your allocation because of environmental and climate conditions. So you find often the South Australian teams get about 17% or 20% of their allocation. And then they have to go into markets and top up that other 80. The challenge is that industry is starting to divest out of what they do because they can't secure water. So if we're seeing that today, imagine what it's going to be like in 2025 or 2030 if we don't get a handle of what is in our water markets. Tasmania Irrigation is probably our leadership in Australia, which is probably a little bit strange for people to hear that, but they've invested very wisely through the Infrastructure Australia to invest in establishing water assets and trading those water assets. So they're way ahead of the rest of Australia. And we're just about to have conversations with RUP in Sydney. They've been working with the New South Wales government in understanding their business process mapping around water trading. And they've been writing quite heavily around why blockchain technology and water actually makes sense. So after 2 years worth of work, and we really have studied, does blockchain technology make sense for water trading? And we have come to the conclusion it does. We're not one of these companies that want to put blockchain on everything. We're very pragmatic, and we're very clear about what it should be used for and what it shouldn't be used for. But when you look at water market trading, we've got opacity, we've got information asymmetry, we've got multiple stakeholders who have an interest in that transaction. And when you put all of that through together, and the other good thing too is that this doesn't need to be settled. We don't need to do 100,000 transactions per second. So we can design this technology to meet the requirements to suit the irrigators in terms of how they trade. So what we're hoping is that through this pilot work, we'll work with RMIT and a couple of other amazing universities and get them to write some papers on this. Because we do lead the world when it comes to water trading, and we also lead the world with regard to where our universities are heading and understanding this tech. So we really want the universities to be able to write about what we're doing so we can actually teach students. Because that's another hat I wear. I'm always passionately advocating around teaching people what we do in universities or even earlier. So they understand, they don't have to wait till they get to their postgraduates and start seeing this word blockchain and understanding what it means. We want to actually put it in the hands of people earlier in their university career to understand how this technology works. So we sort of think if we can solve this for water, what other natural assets can we start to look at? Could we do carbon trading in this country? Probably not. We could, but politically it's probably not going to happen. But it just opens up our mind to start thinking about how do we actually turn these public assets that have value, can be digitised, and turn them into marketplaces that the government do not need to operate. But they have access to it because they have oversight, because they've set the governance rules together on how these markets are going to work. So that's basically us. So if there's any questions, I'm mindful of time, and we have another amazing presentation after me. But I'm going to be around, so if you've got any questions, you can grab me after we finish. But I'm going to hand it to our next presenter because she's got some amazing stuff to talk to you about as well.
I hope that it's amazing, but I'm not sure.
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank
All right.
you.
I think yours is on next. Yes.
Yeah. Thanks, Katrina. Okay, my presentation is the last one, and I have a good news. I'm not a blockchain expert, so my presentation won't be that much technical. So what I will be giving to you today actually is a story of my research and how I ended up researching on blockchain. So my background is transport engineering, and for my PhD I worked on optimization and on behavioral freight econometric model. I think through my presentation you will understand that what was the reason and how I ended up here. Well, I hope that through my presentation I answer some of these questions. But these are the research questions actually that exist. Is there any other solution cheaper and more available or not? And what are the cost trade-off for blockchain and other enterprise solutions or integrated databases? What are the barriers and challenges of this technology, and what are the functional and non-functional properties of different platforms that might be more relevant to this kind of paperwork and processing? Usually these freight agents either email each other or just by telephone communication, they sort out the shipment, and it's very time consuming, and it's also prone to human error, yeah, so that's a very important issue. Then there's the information asymmetry and lack of visibility. There are lots of run of empty trucks, empty containers because of mistakes or because of lack of availability of empty containers. So sometimes the transport carrier doesn't know exactly which container they should take it from the empty container parks. They sometimes take a wrong container. They go to the exporter. That sometimes these exporters are in Toowoomba. They'll be very far and remote places. So you can imagine that again they go there and they notice that because we have different kind of containers that, for instance, for food. It should be a food certificate container. So you can't use a food certificate container for cotton or vice versa. And sometimes there are unpredicted costs. For instance, if a ship has a B-day, then, or for instance, if there's a mistake from one of these freight actors, it's not clear that who should pay this cost. So sometimes there are disputes between these freight actors that who is responsible. Absence of a single source of truth. Definitely every freight agent advocate for its own benefit. And not a cooperative market. We also had 2 weeks of individual container movement, import and export. And for instance, when we looked at the shipment of containers, we noticed that, for instance, there are 2 individual containers, 20-foot, transporting to Oxley within the same postcode, but with 2 different semi-trailers. So if these exporters, if there was information visibility, then maybe we could bundle these shipments into one larger truck. Instead of sending 2 semi-trailers, we could send a B-double truck, and we could save transport costs. The mistake, double work, double movement, already explained. Also, bill of lading that is subject to fraud. So these were the problems that when 3 years ago, when I started looking at these data, then we noticed that we should do something. Okay, so I remember that, yeah, 3 years ago I just looked at the literature and I understood that some European ports, or for instance Port of Singapore, they have port community system, which is a central portal that allows these freight agents to share their information, to coordinate and collaborate. And we need, for visibility, transparency, integration, synchronization, automation, and efficient contracting and data management instead of all of those manual communication. So this central portal could provide the information sharing platform between these freight agents. Yeah, so far so good. It has lots of benefits. Even you can provide the optimized logistics solution for these freight agents, or even you can inform them about the weather or traffic congestion. So there are lots of benefits of port community system. But in the Port of Brisbane, we had difficulty because Port of Brisbane and the other 5 major Australian ports, they're land or ports. So they don't have any authority over freight operators. They can't push or enforce freight operators to use this port community system. And then if they want to launch this portal, then who should bear the cost? Because basically, for instance, Port of Brisbane just rent the land and that's it. So how you would encourage freight operators to pay extra to use such services? And then when we talk to these freight operators, there are lots of other problems. For instance, they were concerned that if they share this data with the Port of Brisbane, even the rent price might increases because they will understand that how benefit or how profit actually they're making. And even the competitiveness between these freight operators. And the other main issue was lack of quantification. So they understand, they think that the status quo has been built based on the experience for a long period of time. So it would be the optimum because they don't have the visibility of all of these inefficiencies. So they think that that's a part of that's the cost of doing business. They don't understand that's necessarily inefficiency cost. Difficulty in adopting new technologies and for some traditional businesses, for instance, a transport operator, which have their own sons managing these transport operations just based on experience. So these were the issues for operators. If when we, I remember when 2 years ago when we presented the benefits of port community system, then they were they mentioned these issues. So then I started looking at, okay, what are the solutions? So a central portal definitely is not a solution. There's a lack of trust between these freight operators and port itself. And there's lack of trust between all of these freight actors as well. Maybe, blockchain might be the solution. But what differentiates blockchain from shared distributed, I won't actually repeat this. I think everyone in this room knows all of this. But what is the difference between this? It just solves the who problem. So basically for port, port won't be concerned that who will maintain this portal and who will be responsible for the security. So every freight agent and every end user will be responsible to maintain that database. So these are the benefits of blockchain. Again, I won't repeat these. So Port of Brisbane is not the first port who is considering blockchain for port community system. We have proof of concepts, but unfortunately these are just at the stage of proof of concept, and none of these POCs have been gone further to the pilot stage, unfortunately, but they're working on it. So these are the ports, and there are some other companies like shipping lines or banks. And because for the port logistics, we have physical movement of data, we have financial flow, and also we have information flow. So, for instance, there are even some banking who has adopted blockchain just for the finance trade and for the electronic bill of lading, but also we have shipping lines that are using blockchain for managing their information flow and so on and so forth. Okay, again, yeah, so I want to explain, this presentation actually is, I didn't change it. I presented 2 months ago in a transport company, in a transport conference, and I was first introduced to the Ethereum white paper by David here. Thanks, David. I had difficulty understanding how does it work, because it wasn't my background, as I said. I don't have any background in IT or whatsoever. So I went to David and I asked, I can't get it entirely. What can I do? And then he suggested me to read the Ethereum white paper. And I think that's really, I think since then, whenever I come across to a new person who is interested in learning blockchain, I say, okay, go and read the Ethereum white paper. It looks like mathematics, but no, if you just look at the relationship between this, then you can understand that how it actually works. These are to-do lists for a blockchain project that I think, first of all, is specifying the business goal that I think at this stage we somehow know for the port project and what are the business goals, and understanding the environment, the challenges and the barriers, and understanding the quality system attributes, that what are the requirements for such project. Definitely we need architectural design choices, and we need experts for that. I'm not that expert. We have we will need model-driven engineering and other components of the system that I just showed in that picture. So definitely we need some people working on smart contracts and on the legal issues of the smart contracts, for digitizing containers, assets, pallets, and everything that we have. APIs to because as I said, all of these expert access, they have their own databases, and they're not willing to give it up. So we need some APIs to just connect and provide interoperability of their databases to a platform that we will provide as ports. And then we need user interfaces designed. So these are stages that we should investigate. Then the main question is whether a public blockchain, a private, or a permission blockchain is suitable for this use case. Well, I don't have the right answer for this, but I assume that it should be a public blockchain with some private sidechains. Hopefully, Peter will help us in that, because every day you will have new actor, new importer, exporter, and there's a lack of trust for these new users. So I don't think that a permission blockchain necessarily might be a solution. Yeah, that's my guess. Just the preliminary analysis that I've done. And yeah, there's another research question: the choice of blockchain layers. That what level of information should be stored in the main chain, whether it should be just hashed, because sometimes when the ship arrives at port, there are thousands transactions per second. So we should somehow do a trade-off between the throughput capacity and latency of transactions, and also privacy. And side chains that Peter already explained, that's what I hope that we can apply for this use case, because I think that's really necessary. There are other design decisions that I just roughly touched. Basically, the project that that Port of Brisbane is now considering is figuring out about the business requirements first, and then jumping on the project, on the pilot. So first we need somehow to understand that what actually might be required for this project, and then we can further investigate it into details. So these are the choices that we should somehow investigate. The choice of consensus mechanism is one of the main ones. I just did a very preliminary analysis of different consensus mechanisms, and hopefully I can actually investigate it more if I'm wrong, with some blockchain experts in this room. I based on some requirements and that my understanding from the port logistics, I evaluated these consensus mechanisms, which one might be more suitable for this use case. And definitely we need a modular design. We need interoperability. We need for instance, a main chain as a platform, and then we need some plug and play features that other blockchains, for instance, if a shipping line like Maersk has its own blockchain, then they can just plug their blockchain into our project, rather than asking every blockchain to be compatible. To use our platform. So that's for sure, that's one of the requirements. And then what Port is now considering is not introducing any cryptocurrency at all, because it might somehow, it might create some concerns between trade actors. In the lack of cryptocurrency, then there would be very important question that what would be the economic value that incentivize these freight agents to use this? For sure, if we show that these are inefficiencies that are borne by each freight access, then it might be one incentive, but still for maintaining the platform, because if we talk about blockchain, then we need that maintaining by freight agents, and there should be a mechanism designed to incentivize each freight actor. So these are ongoing research that we are actually thinking about it at the University of Queensland. And technology and process adoption, again, that's one of the critical questions, because some of these freight transport companies, they don't have that absorption capacity to adopt blockchain in the early stages. So these are the main questions that we're trying to answer. And I did just a very preliminary analysis of requirements and different blockchain platforms, but that's very preliminary stage, and we need to investigate it more. And then we need to also look at other aspects, for instance, about commercial law, legislation, maritime laws, all those legal issues around the smart contract, user training adoption, and that mechanism design that I explained. So that's it. I'm in time.
Thank you, Elnaz. And any questions? We've got time for questions.
Yeah.
So the first initial solution was an overarching principal Powell solution that was going to be too complex to get all the parties
Yes.
together on for of Brisbane developed this overarching system.
Yeah.
So the second solution that you bring is blockchain, where you get Port of Brisbane to build a blockchain solution, and then getting all the other parties involved, meaning hundreds of other parties,
Yeah.
to develop their own blockchain, and then is that what you're sort
Well,
of getting at? Is that
I think that we can't enforce every freight agent to use the port platform, the port blockchain.
Yeah.
As far as I understood, many shipping lines and other freight actors, they're already considering blockchain and they're working on the proof of concept or a pilot or something. So, and we are talking about international trade. So these freight actors are not constrained to Brisbane, to Australia. They're somewhere else. So we need that interoperability for sure. Right now, the pilot, for the pilot, Port of Brisbane doesn't look at all freight agents. We may just consider one single supply chain, for instance, that's cotton export. And for instance, one freight actor, one shipping line, one transport company, one exporter, just for the pilot. But we should ensure that that has the interoperability, that plug and play that I said. That if, for instance, if we use Ethereum, then if shipping line Maersk uses Hyperledger fabric, then it should be compatible, it should be matched, and because otherwise there won't be any.
Yeah, just the fact is, we still got multiple blockchains, and we right back at the start where we couldn't accept. So there's still multiple blockchains run by different companies, and not real, unless there's interoperability.
Yeah. So that's what what I actually hope that maybe Peter's project or a very similar project might provide that interoperability. Otherwise, for sure, again, it would be just like a central database, and it won't succeed.
All right.
Peter, closing remarks.
Thank you, Ellie. All right, so before I get to closing remarks, on the agenda here on the back page, you'll notice that QR code and also that link. So we've had a lot of great speakers today, and I've got a coffee mug here, a Supply Chain on Blockchain 2019 coffee mug. I've actually got two of them just in case it's one of those ones with two speakers. So could you please now vote, go to that URL or scan the QR code, and then I'm going to be able to look with my telephone and see who's won by looking at good old SurveyMonkey. So what a great conference we've had, hey, you know. It's been awesome to have had all these great speakers and all of you and all the people who couldn't quite stay for the end to have come from all around the world and all around Australia. Thank you to the sponsors, Beef Ledger, and to Pegasus Consensus and Integrated Capital. It's been, without their support, this would have been impossible. Thank you to the speakers who've all put in a lot of time to put together some very good presentations. Thank you to the session chairs for helping us to stay on time, and to the people who've helped get the food here, and to the organising committee, so Sandra, Rob and David. So that's been really good. So sometime in the next couple of days, you'll get an email from the conference saying, hey, here's a survey. It'd be great if you could fill it out, because it'd be good to, you know, get feedback on this conference. So,
who's interested in coming next year?
oh, I'm pushing. Doesn't help if you go next slide on the wrong laptop. Exactly, who's interested in coming next year? So July the 13th is a Monday, and so in about 1 year's time we've got this room booked again, and let's try and get to, I think this group could hold 170 people, so let's aim for 170. We hit about 90, 95 today, so 170 would be great. All right, so let's go to SurveyMonkey and see who I'm giving a coffee mug to. Okay, apps opening up. Ooh, we've got 25 responses. And how do I see? All right, so it's the orange one we've got. Okay, Katrina, you are the winner. Yeah. A very, very rare coffee mug. Yes. I don't know the provenance, but it says made in China for the cup itself.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. I guess I just want to thank you, Peter, for putting this together. I know how hard it is putting these things together when you're still working and everything, but I just want to acknowledge the people who have travelled here today, and also the fact that we will come back here and explore, and hopefully we will have some real use cases to really unpack and understand the impact that this technology is making in the different industries we're working on. But thank you.
All right, so thank you everyone. Have a safe trip home, and see you next year, if not before.
Thank you, Peter.
Thanks, Peter. I just had one quick question for you. Do you still want me to throw you some guys if I meet some people who are on our companies too stupid to hire them? So
well, that'd be really good. And by the way, there is a YouTube video with me explaining the use of cross-chain transaction.
I will look it up.
From the last time we did a research meetup, I'm the first one. I had to explain the whole 10 minutes.
Alright, I'll send some guys your way and I'll check out your video.
Okay, great.
See you next time. Cheers.
Great. Yeah, for sure. See you.
Distributed.